It has been said, no man is more hated than he who speaks the truth. Sadly, nowhere is that more true than in politics. Why is that? And is there a hunger for truth and integrity in our elected representatives? Or will we keep settling for the opposite? Join me for a discussion on truth on the Good for America podcast. Welcome to the Good for America podcast. I'm your host, former Congressman Bob Good, former chairman of the House Freedom Caucus. I want to remind you to subscribe to the podcast, rate the show, refer it to your friends, and follow me on social media at Rep Bob Good. I recently read this quote on Twitter, or X, in a post by Kevin Sorbo. It read, "No one is more hated than he who speaks the truth. No one is more hated than he who speaks the truth." It's attributed to Plato, the famous philosopher, and it truly grabbed me and reminded me of the current state of our politics in our country. So I would paraphrase it a little bit and say, no one is more hated in politics than he who speaks the truth. Sadly, there seems to be no appetite, or very little appetite, for a person of truth in politics in Washington, in Congress, or among our elected officials. Certainly not elected officials on either side in Washington, D.C. And too often, it seems, there's not an appetite for a person of truth among the voters who seem to want their ears tickled, who want to be told what they want to hear. Or else, why would the voters keep electing and re-electing these people, these politicians, who are rewarded for giving voters what they want, or at least what voters think they want? Clearly, politicians in both parties are elected and re-elected based on increasing, in the case of Democrats, or at least keeping, in the case of Republicans, the benefits or the goodies Americans think that the government, or at least other people, are paying for. There's no apparent reward in telling voters that this is unsustainable, that it's a lie, and that the voters themselves are actually paying for it, whether it's in higher taxes, more inflation, more debt. And that is what's causing so much financial hardship, or what's known as the affordability crisis today, that it's the spending, the debt, the borrowing that's causing the higher taxes, the more inflation, the more debt, the affordability crisis today. And worse, the bill that's coming due for our children and our grandchildren will be even higher. But the contempt or the hatred of the very few truth tellers in politics comes most intensely from the other politicians, certainly from the Democrats, because truth-telling conservatives expose the fallacy of liberal policies, the lie that is socialism, Marxism, communism, that it has never worked. And it is simply the loss of freedom and shared poverty and misery for everybody. But the truth is, most Republicans are not really conservatives. They just play them on TV. And therefore, most Republicans hate the actual conservatives, especially the ones with some semblance of courage, some willingness to speak truth. Because the words, the actions, and the votes of the few actual courageous conservatives exposes the phony TV conservatives, or at least it used to. Not so much since Trump was elected and Republicans took full control of Washington, because now almost all Republicans are doing the opposite of conservatism, and they're voting for more deficit spending via the expansion, or at least the extension of Biden's COVID budget. What have Republicans, all but one or two, voted for this past year twice to extend or even expand Biden's COVID budget? Again, it's always and only about the money in Washington. Show me your checkbook. I'll show you your priorities. That's all that matters, is how they're taking and spending our money. So again, Republicans are doing the opposite of conservatism in Washington when they're voting for more deficit spending and the expansion, or at least the extension, of Biden's COVID budget, something they all voted against over the last 4 years before Republicans got full control of government this year. Worse yet, if Republicans, God forbid, they do an extension of the Obamacare subsidies that are set to expire at the end of the year, the massive amount of subsidies that Biden added during COVID, where people making up to about $150,000 a year can get free Obamacare, free healthcare, at least free in the sense that they're not making monthly premiums, or people making up to $600,000 can get subsidized healthcare, subsidized by your tax dollars under the Obamacare enhanced COVID subsidies that Biden put in place. Those are going to expire at the end of December, and Republicans are under pressure to make a deal or to let them expire. Obviously, they should let them expire. Also, the opposite of conservatism would be to do a bad spending bill when the government funding ends January 31. So coming out of the Schumer shutdown, the deal to fund the government, 3/4 of that spending, 75% of it expires January 31. So we're less than 2 months away from another shutdown fight. What will Republicans be willing to do to avoid a shutdown now that it's an election year? What will they be willing to do to avoid a shutdown? What kind of a bad deal are they going to make with Democrats to spend more money, to extend the Obamacare subsidies now that it's an election year? The 26 midterms are on the horizon. That's why I said back in the summer that 2025 was the year for Republicans. This was the year before the 26 midterms, before Trump becomes a lame duck president, that Republicans needed to go big and bold now in 2025, that they should use the reconciliation bill back last summer, or by doing a second reconciliation bill now, when they don't need 60 votes in the Senate and they can do anything that they want with a simple majority. But instead, Republicans made things worse fiscally in the big ugly bill, the bill that was passed back in July that we talked about so much on this podcast. And sadly, the very few Republicans in Washington who object to continuing Biden's COVID level spending, or who were against the big ugly bill that's taken the national debt from its current 38 trillion to 60, 65 trillion over the next 10 years. Those very few who object, almost all of whom seem to reside or live in Kentucky, I think Thomas Massie and Rand Paul, these principled, courageous Republicans who are not going along to get along, they are attacked for not wanting to keep the spending train on the track to fiscal ruin. They're called rhinos or even Democrats because they're objecting to the deficit spending. They're attacked and smeared, and in Thomas Massie's case, he's being primaried by President Trump for not going along with whatever Trump says and what the majority of Republicans do. Hey, they're accused of not being team players when the team wants to do the wrong thing. So there's a reason why I focus more on Republicans than Democrats. That was the case during my 4 years in Washington. It's the case during this podcast. Elected Democrats are a lost cause. They know what they're doing, and they're doing it on purpose. They want to destroy, or they would say transform, America as we know it. They hate our founders. They hate the founding of our country, our Constitution. They hate our Judeo-Christian principles and our nation's history. They don't believe in American exceptionalism, American sovereignty. They don't believe in an America worth preserving and protecting. That's why they want to flood America with non-Americans. That's why you had the Biden Democrat border invasion over the last 4 years with some 15 million illegals coming into our country, unvetted or poorly vetted. They want to flood America with non-Americans so it will no longer be America. That's what happens when a significant percentage of your population, and the population in this country has changed both through the illegal invasion, through legal immigration, and through the educational indoctrination in our school systems, our K-12 school systems and on our college campuses. But when you have a significant percentage of your population that doesn't believe in your form of government, doesn't believe in your Constitution or your values, in the case of the immigrants, don't speak your language, when a majority of your population is riding in the economic wagon instead of helping to pull the economic wagon, you're no longer America. And elected Democrats, they want this. So again, that's why I don't focus on Democrats. Forget about the Democrats. Try to expose them, try to defeat them, But forget about the Democrats. The answer, obviously, is not with the Democrat Party. We should be focused on getting or forcing Republicans to actually fight for our country, to electing principled, courageous conservatives to represent us. Part of that's educating the public, which is what we try to do on this podcast, because our country's present and our future is dependent upon a moral and religious citizenry. Our values, our principles, what we believe in, they matter. An educated and informed citizenry that understands our history, that understands our Constitution, that understands our form of government, and, of course, perhaps most importantly, an engaged and participating citizenry that's engaged in political discourse, engaged in our society, in our civic culture, is voting, is advocating, is contributing, and fighting to get the right kind of people elected. That we need a nation of people who, again, are moral and religious, educated, informed, engaged and participating, who will vote and vote right and demand the right actions from our elected officials, who will demand and require truth from our elected officials, truth on the issues, this truth about our debt and our spending, the unsustainable nature and the unconstitutional nature of our entitlements, that Social Security and Medicare must be reformed to be preserved for future generations, that the welfare system has to be reformed and ultimately reduced massively, as does nationalized health care. It needs to be reformed and replaced with a market system. We need elected officials who will tell the truth, that it matters just as much, if not more, when Republicans borrow and spend as it does when Democrats do it. The truth is, it matters just as much, if not more, when Republicans borrow and spend as when Democrats do it. The dollars spend or don't spend the same, meaning that the dollars they spend, they take from us in the form of taxes and government spending, spend the same, whether it's Republicans or Democrats. And when we have less dollars, it doesn't matter if Democrats took them from us or Republicans took them from us, it counts the same. So we need truth in exposing the failure of Republicans. Republicans who are lying to us about what they're doing or what they will do when they're in campaign season. Here we go to 26th campaign. What are Republicans going to run on? $40 trillion in debt, more than a $2 trillion deficit, raising the debt limit by $5 trillion in the big ugly bill over the summer. What are Republicans going to run on again next year in 26? The truth is that the government spent $689 billion in the month of October and ran a $284 billion deficit in October. Let's just round off. The government spent $700 billion in October and ran a $300 billion deficit in October, meaning we spent $300 billion more than we took in. October is the first month of the fiscal year. The fiscal year starts on October 1, runs to September 30. So we're on track after 1 month. We don't have November numbers yet. We're on track after 1 month of having an $8.3 trillion in spending and a $3.4 trillion deficit. So I've talked a lot about how we're spending $7 trillion a year. Well, October, we started out spending at a rate of over $8 trillion a year. And I've talked a lot about the $2 trillion annual deficit. Well, in October, the first month of the fiscal year, we started at a rate of having a $3 trillion deficit. So it's getting worse instead of better. We need politicians, elected officials, who will tell us the truth about the tariffs, the Trump tariffs, which are going to likely be ruled as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court without congressional approval. The Constitution makes it clear that only Congress has the power to tax and to apply tariffs. And so I think they'll be ruled unconstitutional. But the truth is they're not going to eliminate the deficit despite what Trump says. Spending cuts are required. There's no way around it. Spending cuts are required. The most optimistic estimates on the tariffs are that they might bring in about $350 billion a year, something over $300 billion a year. But the deficit is over $2 trillion a year, or again, based on the month of October, might be $3 trillion. So tariffs might be a net positive from a revenue standpoint. That's even hard to project because they seem to change monthly, weekly, if not daily. Do we have tariffs or don't we have tariffs? But the tariffs might bring in some net revenue, But they also, as other countries respond with tariffs of their own, it could reduce our exports, our manufacturing, and reduce any net positive impact. But even if the most optimistic estimates are true that they'll bring in $300 billion a year, a little more, that's only a fraction of, again, $2 to $3 trillion deficit. And then more recently, President Trump has talked about, hey, because of tariffs, we'll be able to get rid of the income tax. Okay, we collect about $3 trillion a year in income taxes, and that is about 10 times, again, the most optimistic estimate of tariff money. So if you're taking $300 billion a year in tariff money, you can't get rid of 10 times that amount, $3 trillion a year in income taxes, without obviously destroying the fiscal situation. What the president should be doing, and Congress should be doing, is boldly calling for abolishing the IRS and eliminating the income tax. I co-sponsored a bill to do that, to eliminate the income tax and replace it with a national sales tax. We should have a national sales tax instead of an income tax. The income tax was unconstitutional originally, and then, of course, with the amendment, the Constitution, it was added in the 16th Amendment, I think it was, that allowed the government to have an income tax. We ought to repeal that, abolish the IRS, and go to a national sales tax. A national sales tax hits the richest people the hardest because they spend the most money and buy the most expensive things. And it's impossible to hide it from the voters or the citizens. If you knew every time you bought something how much the federal government was taking from you because you saw it on your receipt and you had to add it to the bill, that instead of it coming out of your paycheck and you're not really comparing your net and your gross, it's just your take-home pay, but you saw it every time you bought something, then you would be aware of what your government is doing to you, and the politicians couldn't raise it without your knowledge or complicate it in a way that makes it hard to understand. And the thing about a national sales tax, in addition to it being fair, it hits the richest people the hardest. You couldn't have it but so high without reducing consumption. People stop buying things, they don't want to pay it. And so that incentivizes the politicians to keep it as low as possible. Plus, you could exempt groceries and medicine and household essentials to help the lower income folks not have to pay on the most essential things. But again, that would be a bold, courageous, conservative proposition. Let's get rid of the income tax and replace it with a national sales tax. And then you could combine that with the tariffs and fund the government that way. That would really be an impressive thing and a legacy thing for President Trump. But the other thing we need to speak truth about, again, is that the tariffs don't make the $2,000 stimulus checks that Trump's talking about a good idea. It's not affordable. The rationalization for the tariffs is, hey, we're going to use it to pay down the debt, reduce the deficit. Well, if you turn around and send out $2,000 stimulus checks next year, as Trump's talking about doing, then you undermine or negate the so-called or supposed purpose of the tariffs. And of course, sending out stimulus checks is the same thing that Biden did during COVID, which is what caused so much inflation. I find myself wondering when Trump says things like he did just a day or two ago, that, hey, we're bringing in trillions and trillions of dollars from the tariffs. Again, where the most optimistic estimates are $300 billion. Does he not know the difference between billions and trillions? Or is he intentionally just using hyperbole and misleading people? I don't know. But that's kind of like when he's claimed that inflation is gone and grocery prices are down, and everybody who goes to the grocery store and has to buy groceries actually has to do that, knows that's not true. Or he claims that gas is $2 a gallon when everybody knows it's more like $3 a gallon. But at any rate, we need truth tellers in Washington. Truth that exposes the Republican Party and holds it accountable. Truth that exposes the Republican Party when it's violating its principles, its convictions, and not showing courage. Truth about the Republican Party being self-serving and focusing simply on obtaining and retaining power, just having or getting the majority just so it can keep the majority. We need truth-telling regarding things like regime change in Venezuela. When the president is talking about regime change, that doesn't work. It conflicts with the Monroe Doctrine, the 200-year-old Monroe Doctrine that says, we don't use our power in the Western Hemisphere to impose our will on other countries, that we consider when nations come into the Western Hemisphere to be an attack or a threat to us, but we also don't use our power for imperialistic purposes to remove governments in other countries in the Western Hemisphere. So we need Republicans to tell the truth about their concern about the regime change that President Trump's calling for in Venezuela. It betrays what Republicans ran on, that we're not going to do nation building. We'll talk more about that on a future podcast. But we need truth telling about the reported proposed Russia-Ukraine deal. Why is all the pressure on Ukraine and all the consequences of the deal to be suffered by Ukraine, having to give up land, having to reduce their number of troops, reduce their weapons, agree never to join NATO? Seems that the only requirement of Russia is to stop killing Ukrainians. But Russia will have no interest in abiding by any kind of a deal. Just look at their history. And as I've said often about a government shutdown, he who wants a deal most loses. He who wants a deal most loses. So it seems like if we want a deal more than Russia does, then it's going to be a deal that's going to be very favorable to Russia. We'll talk more about this in a future podcast as well. But speaking of truth, I do also want to just touch briefly on the current fight between Elise Stefanik, the former Republican conference chair, the congresswoman from New York. She was Trump's UN ambassador before he pulled her nomination. She's running for governor in New York. There's a fight going on between Elise Stefanik and Speaker Mike Johnson. Stefanik is upset that a provision she had in the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, was pulled without her knowledge. Her provision would require the FBI to notify Congress when they're investigating candidates for federal office. Well, that got pulled out of the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, and when Elise Stefanik complained about it, she says Mike Johnson said, hey, that's the first I've heard about it. I had no idea this was happening. Now, he's the speaker. But I will tell you, that was consistent with my view with him. Again, he said about Elise Stefanik's provision being pulled from the bill, hey, the first I've heard of it, I had no idea. That's what he would do during my time with him as speaker. He would feign ignorance of anything that was tough or controversial. He was not a man of his word. He was not a man of truth. He either repeatedly lies or he fails to ensure that he is advised of what's going on by his staff, by his leadership team. But to Stefanik's credit, whatever her motivations are, she's publicly calling him out and accusing him of lying to protecting the deep state. With respect to protecting the deep state, I can tell you that after he became speaker, he changed his position on a warrant amendment for FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, where he before he became speaker, supported that the federal government ought to have a warrant with probable cause in order to spy on a U.S. citizen. After he became speaker, he changed his mind on that and voted against that warrant amendment, and it failed. Just saying, just telling you what my experience was with him. So I mentioned earlier in the podcast that voters seem to be increasingly supportive of politicians who tell them what they want to hear. And I said that tickle their ears. Well, that phrase comes from a biblical passage describing what people will want in the last days. The Apostle Paul, in his last letter or book, his last words to young Timothy before he was beheaded, Apostle Paul was martyred, beheaded for his faith. He just exhorted Timothy to speak the truth, regardless of what other people do, regardless of what the hearers or the listeners want to hear. So in the Apostle Paul's last book, his last letter, his final words in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 2-5, he writes, preach the word, correct, rebuke, and encourage with great patience and careful instruction. For the time will come when people will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. They will turn their ears away from the truth and turn aside to myths. But you, keep your head in all situations, endure hardship, do the work of an evangelist, discharge all the duties of your ministry. Could this be the last days of the Republic? It will be if we don't rise up as a people and demand change, a change in course. If we keep electing and re-electing the same people and letting them keep doing the same things, isn't that what's described as a definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results? The politicians aren't going to change on their own. That much is clear. But we, the people, do have the ability to change it. This is still a government of the people, by the people, for the people. We will exercise the power that we have as a people. As we open this podcast with the quote, no man is more hated in politics, my parentheses added, than he who speaks the truth. I can tell you that I am thankful that I've experienced many exceptions to that in my time traveling Virginia's 5th District or my time representing Virginia's 5th District. I received a lot of faithful and enthusiastic support from people across the district who were hungry for truth and integrity in their elected representatives. But that's not what we have with the majority of our elected officials. Politicians will always choose the path of least resistance, or the path that enables them to obtain or retain power. So we've got to align their interests with ours. We've got to penalize them for doing the wrong thing and reward them for doing the right thing. That is how we keep the republic. So thanks for joining me on this episode of the Good for America podcast. Please remember to subscribe to the podcast, rate this show, refer it to your friends, follow me on social media at Rep Bob Good. Let's keep the republic.